This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode 51 of the Photographing the West podcast, where twice a month we interview interesting people doing interesting things. Each episode is brought to you by Flanagan Photos. Today I have with me well-known nature and wildlife photographer Lewis Kemper, and we're going to talk about his switch from Canon to Nikon and his reasons for changing. But this is not about bashing one system or the other. Both companies make great products. It's about comparing and contrasting the two systems to better understand the advantages and disadvantages of each. Lewis was kind enough to be one of my very early guests on Photographing the West back in March 2017. So thank you for that, Lewis. And welcome back. It's great to have you on the show again.
It's nice to be back. I was trying to remember how long ago it was, and then you just filled me in.
Okay, good. Yeah, quite a while. Lots has changed. Better for the better, I hope.
Right.
So we want to talk about your change from the Canon system to the Nikon system. Obviously, changing camera systems is not cheap or easy. So why the change?
Well, for me, there was really only one reason that made me change. I do a lot of long exposure images using strong neutral density filters where my exposures are anywhere from 4 minutes to 8 minutes long. And when I was doing those with the Canon system, if it's warm outside and really just above, 70, 75 degrees, and I live in Sacramento, California, where frequently we have temperatures in the hundreds, when you do those long exposures with the Canon system, you get red, blue, and green dots in your shadow areas that look like somebody's hung thousands of Christmas tree lights. And there's no way to remove those digitally after the fact. You can use long exposure noise reduction in the camera to take care of those. But if you're photographing a sunset and doing 4-minute exposures, and then you have to wait another 4 minutes for the image to process, you get one shot during a sunset. And that just got way too frustrating for me. And I just started experimenting with some other cameras to see if there were any systems that were better. So I checked out basically just two. I checked out the Sony A7R 2 and 3 and the Nikon D850. And I found that the D850 gave me the absolute cleanest looking images of all the systems without having to apply my long exposure noise reduction.
So what you were getting were hot pixels, not chromatic aberration, I'm assuming, huh?
Right. And by the thousands basically. And you could make the color go away, but then you were left with white dots everywhere. So there was no way to totally clean up the image and make it look good. And the interesting thing, as I mentioned, if it was cold outside, that wasn't an issue with the Canon cameras, but as soon as it got warm, that would be a problem.
Sure, yeah. Well, so you had lots of Canon equipment, I'm sure, prior to the changeover. So talk about that, and then what Nikon gear are you using now?
Yeah, I was shooting with the Canon 5D Mark IVs, and I had a couple of those. And actually, I didn't have too many Canon lenses. Mostly, I've been working with Tamron lenses lately. So I had a bunch of Tamron lenses and a couple Canon lenses and the Canon flash, and obviously all the little cable releases and things that were Canon oriented. So I had a fire sale basically, and sold off a bunch of the old equipment. And now I have two Nikon D850s and one Nikkor lens, the 24 to 85, and my 3 Tamron lenses, which are the 15 to 30, the 150 to 600, and the 100 to 400.
I'm curious how you like the 150 to 600 for wildlife.
Oh, I love that lens. I've been using that lens actually, well, since the very first one came out. So I don't know, I lost track of years, but probably about 4 years now or so, maybe a little bit longer. And definitely, I just love that lens for wildlife because pretty much one lens does everything, and I don't have to, carry around a lot of stuff. It's easy to hand hold. It's very sharp, and the image stabilization is great. So yeah, that's except for the weight, carrying around after a long time, but it's not that heavy compared to, other 600 millimeter lenses. So it's a whole lot. Yeah.
Oh, good to know. So, did you consider mirrorless at all when you were considering
Well, I
switching?
did. I looked at the Sony. In fact, that was my first look was the Sony, the A7R2 was when I first started, looking and trying to decide if I was going to make a switch or not. And unfortunately, the couple times I have a friend who's got one and lives in the Bay Area, and the couple times we got together to switch, and I tested it, it just was never that warm outside. So it was better than the Canon, but I just, wasn't quite sure if it was going to cut it when it was 100 degrees or not. And then and I put off the decision because, making the change is a big deal and expensive. So when the A7 R3 came out, we met somewhere where it was hot, and I got to do a test when it was about 107 degrees outside, and it was a lot better than the Canon, but there was still some of that hot pixel noise. And then a friend of mine here in town had the D850, and I went over and just stood in her backyard and did some tests. And it was, again, another really hot day, about 107 degrees outside. It was that same week. And, shot with the Nikon, and it was just totally clean. And that's when I decided I just had to do something about it.
Yeah, that's a problem that doesn't get talked about much is hot pixels unless you're obviously doing
Nobody tests for
long
that.
exposures.
If you read any review, nobody tests for long exposure noise, and the hot pixel noise. And for most people, if they talk anything about a long exposure, it's like a 30-second exposure shooting the stars or something. And nobody in any review ever talks about a really long exposure.
Yeah, why is that, do you think?
Well, I think number one, because a lot of people just don't do them. And so they don't think about that part, but every camera is so different. The Canon was, I thought, fine at high ISO noise, and I never had any problem with that with the camera, but it was just that long exposure hot pixel noise. And people only compare the high ISO noise, and they compare all this other stuff, but nobody, I went and scoured every review I could possibly find before making a decision, and found that there was no information for what I wanted.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true because I've sure never seen anything about that. So
right. Yeah,
so
nobody sticks a 15-stop neutral density filter on these cameras when they're testing and see what they do.
yeah, yeah. I was looking at your website, and it produces some really unique photos, particularly with the movement of the clouds.
Yeah, and it's been great with the Nikon. When I see the files come off and don't have any worries and no hot pixels at all, and can shoot 4 minutes and 8 minutes and not even think about it. It's just great.
So you mentioned too in your blog posts that you noticed wider dynamic range with the 850. Is that right?
Yeah, the dynamic range seems to be, I'd say, about a stop and a half wider, which is nice because there's some situations. I do also a lot of HDR stuff, and there are many situations where I don't need to do that anymore. There's still plenty where I still find that I get, better color and more latitude doing the HDR as opposed to, I know a lot of people who have like the Sony and the Nikon and say they totally stopped doing HDR because of the wide latitude of the dynamic range of the sensors. And, there's definitely a lot of circumstances where that works, but I still find, pointing into the sun at a deep sunset with a lot of color and deep shadows, that I like my results better doing the HDR than doing it straight.
Yeah, that would certainly make sense in that situation. Yeah, I think the wider dynamic range of the newer cameras is pretty amazing and doesn't
Yeah.
get talked about a lot, but it sure makes life a lot easier.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it is. It's really quite amazing.
So when you made the switch, did you have to buy all new lenses or did you use adapters or how did you deal with that?
Well, I was kind of lucky, and that's actually one of the things that sort of forced my hand. As I mentioned, I've been using a fair amount of Tamron lenses, and I established a business relationship with Tamron, and I basically have been, supplying images or writing a little blog post or something for them in exchange for lenses. So I had, three, well, actually, I had four at the time that I really liked with the Canon. And it was the 15 to 30, the 100 to 400, the 150 to 600. And I had a 180 macro lens that were all Tamron lenses. So I wrote to my contact at Tamron and told her I was, thinking about switching to Nikon. What would I have to do to earn new lenses? And she just wrote back and she goes, "Well, are your lenses in good shape?" She goes, "Because I'll just swap them out for you and I'll start the paperwork now." And I hadn't even decided yet whether I was going to do this or not. So I wrote back and, thanked her very much for that offer and said, "But, give me a week. I have to really decide if I'm going to do this or not." And when I realized I wasn't going to have to be, spending all that money, it made the decision, a whole lot easier. The one sort of downside was the 180 macro that I had, Tamron doesn't make anymore. So I wasn't able to get a new macro lens from them. So right now I'm short a macro lens. I'm just kind of waiting and seeing if they're going to come out with a 180 or maybe I'll just get a 90 at some point. So once I realized I didn't have to buy new lenses, kind of really made my decision much easier. And I realized I could sell my Canon gear that I had and make enough money to get the new bodies. And the one lens that I really loved from Canon was my 24 to 105. And I just loved that range because when I do travel, or especially international travel, I'll just take, two camera bodies and have the 24 to 105 on one and either the 100 to 400 or the 150 to 600, depending on the kind of trip that I'm doing, on another body. And that would be all I would need to take on a trip. And Tamron doesn't make a lens that wide. They have, like a 24 to 70, but from 70 to 100 or 70 to 150 is way too big of a gap for me to feel comfortable with in my focal lengths. So I realized I was going to need to get, another lens to fit that bill. So I checked out a couple of those and ended up settling on the Nikkor 24 to 85, even though it wasn't quite as long as I wanted. I found that lens, to me, seemed to be sharper than their 24 to 120 was.
Personal question. I'm going to be traveling overseas next September, and I've been debating about what camera bag to use to get on the international flights without problems. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I use, and I don't know if the name has changed or whatever. I use the Think Tank Airport Commuter, which was the bag that fit, U.S. commuter flights, which is actually the same standard as international flights. And now actually even a lot of the major airlines have cut back to that commuter bag size. So I really like that Think Tank bag. It holds, for me, I can put, two bodies, three lenses, including the 150 to 600. So I can take like the 150 to 600 to 24 to 85 and the 15 to 30, two bodies, my hard drives and, my ball head fits in there and a couple other, smaller things. So I like that bag a whole lot.
Yeah, sounds like it might be what I'm looking for. So thank you for
Yeah,
that.
you're welcome.
Where are you at on the Nikon learning curve now, having had it for what 3 months or so?
Yeah. Well, as I always say, right now I kind of have a love-hate relationship with the camera. I love the pictures that come off the camera, but the handling of the camera and the menu system, and it to me is just not ergonomically designed as well as the Canon cameras. And people say you'll get used to it or whatever, and it's not so much getting used to. It's just things that I could do with one hand or two fingers on the Canon camera are either take two hands or are really actually impossible to do when holding a camera with the Nikon and stuff. And it's not that getting used to. It's just the way I tell people is Canon people don't know how good the well, Sony makes them, but the Sony sensors are, and have no idea what a really great looking file is like. And the Nikon people have no idea what a really well designed camera is like. But so I don't know if you can merge the two. Like if I could rip the sensor out of my D850 and stick it back into that Canon 5D4, that would be the ideal camera for me.
Probably not going to happen anytime soon.
No, I haven't figured out how to do that.
So specifically, what are the differences and frustrations with the change?
Some of the biggest, I'll say two, and then I'll come up with more. But some of the biggest frustration for me with the Nikon is I shoot on auto ISO a lot in manual mode, and then I do exposure compensation. So on the Canon camera system, on the right-hand side in the viewfinder, vertically, you have your exposure scale, and it goes all the way from 3 stops up to 3 stops down. And when you change your exposure compensation, even in manual mode in auto ISO, you see that you're set for minus exposure or plus exposure or whatever. In the Canon camera system, when you look through the viewfinder, number one, exposure, which to me is like the most important thing in photography, is this tiny little scale that doesn't even show 2 stops of range in either direction. And it's on the bottom crammed in with every other thing. And if you use exposure compensation in manual mode in auto ISO, it doesn't show you inside the viewfinder what your exposure compensation is unless you reach up to the top of the camera and push a button in and see that you have your camera set to an exposure compensation. And I don't know how many times I've raised that camera and taken pictures, and been at -1.5 or something, and have no idea when I look through the viewfinder that I'm using exposure compensation and what it's set to. There's a little teeny symbol that lights up that tells you you're using exposure compensation, but when you're looking through the viewfinder, you have to really hunt for that. And and to me, just the whole thing of the exposure being so important and it being such a minor part of the viewfinder system in the Nikon is horrible. And so that drives me crazy. Another one is with the Canon camera, I could use my thumb on a toggle switch to change my focal points inside the viewfinder. And then I moved over one button and I could push that button and change the number of focal points. On the Nikon camera, I can still toggle my focus points with my thumb, but to change the number of focus points is on the left-hand side of the camera where the lens mounts to the camera, where you have to push in a button. So if you're holding a 150 to 600 millimeter lens, you have to let go of the lens to reach that button to push it in and then spin a wheel at the same time to change your number of focal points. So it's something that you physically cannot even do when you're holding the camera. It's pointless as far as I'm concerned. It's like one of those, what were they thinking when they designed this ideas? So that drives me crazy. That, it's just in that what were they thinking kind of category. So just, things like that just drive you a little bit crazy.
I don't have an 850, but I think most Nikon cameras, the professional grade ones at least, are pretty similar.
And yeah, they all have the button on that left-hand side.
But you also have the ability to program most of the buttons on the right-hand side to do different things. I assume
you can program it. Yes, I can push in my toggle and change to one group setting or one other additional setting. but there's no way I can cycle through all the different focal point settings on the Nikon. It just isn't made. Another one that kills me is on the Canon camera. I had, on the dial at the top, I had 3 customs, C1, C2, and C3. So on my wildlife camera, I can set C1 to be, spot meter, shutter speed of, 640, an aperture of f10, auto ISO, and a certain focal point group. And, that was my standard for wildlife that's standing still. And then if I saw that bird was getting the fly, I could just reach up without taking my eye away from the viewfinder, switch it into C2 and go to a 4,000th of a second, a wider metering pattern, a different depth, a different f-stop, and all for birds in flight. There's no equivalent at all to do that on the Nikon system. So you have to, pull the camera down and change all your dials and buttons. And of course, by the time you do that, the bird's gone. So that drives me crazy, that they built that camera with no way, to save custom settings of all your settings. And it's like, they just added that to the D5 for a firmware upgrade earlier this year, which to me, that it wasn't even in that camera is just totally mind-boggling. But they never added it to the D850. So,
and they have it now in the Z7, which I recently bought. So
yeah,
I guess
so it's like
they're thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, to me that was, and then when I went into C3, I went into my video mode. It dropped my shutter speed to, a 30th of a second, and it, gave me a different aperture so I could right away go and hit my video button and start shooting video. And, there's just nothing like that on the Nikon camera. So every time I'm photographing that heron and I see it's getting ready to fly, I got to spin the wheel and try to get it up to 4,000 seconds, change the aperture, push in my other button to get the wider metering system. And by the time I do that, I never get the shot when they take off anymore. It just doesn't happen. I just sit there and I curse.
Well, don't do that.
Yeah.
Again, I think I haven't tried it myself, but from what I've read, you can now do that with the Z7 as well, and I'm assuming with the Z6. Some of the reviews I've read said it was even better that video was even better on the Z6 than on the Z7. So there's some hope, I guess.
Right. To me, it seems like, do the Nikon engineer, obviously the engineers never do, but do the designers or somebody ever use these things in the field in a real world situation besides a studio or something? Because it's just not, to me, it's just not designed efficiently at all.
Yeah, I think all Nikon users have wondered about that at one time or another. Certainly I have.
Yeah. And and another one that gets me sort of, and I don't know if this is me, every time I change the lens, I mean, I can be inside my office and change the lens and go out, I get dust on my sensor. And they have the sensor cleaning mode on the Nikon, which is totally silent. And to me, it seems like it's just a menu setting and it doesn't do anything, because I'll clean the thing 6 times and, nothing changes. And on the Canon, when you went into the sensor cleaning, you actually heard it vibrating and shaking and whatever, and it worked great. I never had a dust problem in my 5D Mark IVs. I scratched the sensor already on one of my D850s and had to send it in and spend almost $800 to replace it because of the crap on the sensor. And I've been cleaning sensors for 15 years and never had a problem before.
Well, that's got to be pretty frustrating.
Yeah, so that killed me. And again, yesterday, I got the lens. I just recently got that camera back, stuck one lens on it and never changed it. Yesterday I did a lens change. Now I'm looking at the pictures. I changed it indoors, and now I'm looking at the pictures and there's spots all over it. And it's like, oh my God.
Huh.
Yeah.
I'm not heard of that as being a major problem, so I'm not sure
Yeah, in fact, it was funny when I was thinking about doing it. I spoke to somebody and he goes, "Oh yeah, I go to Africa and I change my lenses all the time out in the field. You'll love the 850. There's never a dust problem." And it's like, God, I just look at mine and it gets dust on the sensor. So I don't know. And then you, like I said, you turn on the sensor clean and it doesn't make any noise or do anything. And it's like, is this really just a menu? Is it doing something, or is this just a menu item to make you feel better?
Yeah, I would have to say I don't hear anything when I use the sensor cleaning on my cameras either. But
Yeah, nobody. Yeah, and I asked all around, and none of the Nikon systems make any noise when they do it. So, like I said, I just always curious whether it's really doing something or not.
well, it might be worth asking Nikon.
Yeah, I actually want to look up and see, how does their sensor cleaning system work? What does it do when it's,
Or
being
if,
so
or
quiet?
or if yours is working or not, I guess. So
So
what are the good things about the changeover, would you say,
I'd say,
aside from the lack of hot pixels?
yeah, I mean, just the dynamic range, the images are really, really nice. And I think that I actually like the color a little bit better on the Nikon, the images. I think I like the greens, the more subtle greens and textures sort of that I get with those colors. I like the articulating screen on the back that I didn't have. What else is? Those are the main features I'd say that I like better. And it's just really just, I mean, and of course the larger files. I was at 32 megapixels, excuse me, on the Canon, and now being at 47, it's like, you know, you got a lot of extra pixels there, which is really nice,
Right.
especially, with the wildlife. If you need to crop or whatever, I don't even think about it anymore. It's like you get an extra 200 millimeters of focal length with your croppability.
True, yeah. I guess I didn't realize, I thought the 5D systems were all up in the 40 some megapixels.
No,
No?
there is one, the R and the S, I think, are up around, I forget what they are, right around 40 or so. One's close to 50, but yeah, and the Canon and the high megapixel cameras, they weren't so hot at the higher ISOs. Even, I mean, it's at noise without being the long exposures. They all worked better, kind of more under studio conditions where you could be at 100 ISO kind of thing. So, that versatility. I mean, I can shoot with the Nikon at 8,000 ISO and it looks, like the Canon did at 4,000 or something, at 3,200, uh, or even sometimes better than it did. So, the high ISO part of the Nikon is really good. So I like that a lot.
Well, that's good to know. Yeah, I've felt comfortable going up to ISO 3200 without worrying about it too much. I don't go
Uh, I've
much
shot,
higher than that.
I've shot a bunch of wildlife stuff at 8,000 and it looks great, and I couldn't, when I shot at 64 on the Canon, it was like, only if this is really a special something or another going on was the picture acceptable. But I'm finding, like I said, I mean, I can shoot at 8,000 ISO on the Nikon, and if it's a little noisy, you run it through something. I use Neat Image noise reduction software, and it's just, they look fine. So when you shoot, I do a lot of stuff, hand holding from a kayak, so that
Right.
capability on a darker day, because I need to shoot at a minimum of 500th of a second, and even then in the kayak, I feel much more comfortable at 640th of a second than 500. And you're trying to get any kind of depth of field, you end up at around, those high ISO 6400 and 8000 pretty easily.
How do you like the Nikon auto ISO feature?
Well, except for the fact that I can't see my exposure compensation, inside when, Canon had auto ISO too. And like I said, I could see my exposure compensation just picking up the camera and looking through it. So I liked that a lot better. The auto ISO seems to work really well on the Nikon, but, not being able to see what my exposure compensation is without having to reach up and push a button, and then you get a number and it just goes like 0.7, it doesn't even tell you whether you're plus or minus, I don't think, on the inside that I can remember. You just have to remember which way you went. And so like I said, that visual part of it, kind of kills me. And they've got that whole right-hand side of the viewfinder that they don't really use for anything in the Nikon. It's like, I don't understand why they don't put their exposure information up there.
Yeah, I've found similar frustration with the compensation not showing up in the viewfinder, and didn't know there was a difference between the two systems actually.
Oh yeah, I mean, and then the other thing, when bracketing, if I set my camera to 3 exposure bracketing, if I look inside, the little BKT shows up, real tiny in the viewfinder, but I don't know where on the scale the bracketing is with the exposure compensation. I don't know if it's, if they're set to 2 stops or 1 stop unless I hit a button kind of thing. And, on the Canon, you had your whole scale up on the right side. And as soon as you looked through, if you saw 3 dots, you knew you were set to bracket. If I saw 5 dots, I knew I was set, bracketing. And when I did the exposure compensation, the dots went up and down the scale, and I could see exactly where I was placing things. And, you can't do that looking through the viewfinder on the Nikon at all. You got to take your eye away and either look on the top panel or turn on the info thing on the back. Drives you a little crazy. Like I said, I think the Nikon people have no idea what it's like to handle a camera that was really well designed with your picture taking experience in mind. And the Canon people don't know what it's like to see a really beautiful image come off a sensor that looks great.
So you have any thoughts about getting mirrorless cameras, Z6 or Z7?
I don't know. I might look into that later. Right now, I spent all the money I have to spend on the changeover between I had to get new flash and new cables and the cameras itself and new filters and things are all different sizes. But I think about it. I still like to use. It would also mean buying all new lenses, because to me, to get the body and slap it on the 150 to 600, for the little bit of weight I'm going to save or whatever, it doesn't seem worth the money for something like that. So I have to kind of wait and see how the lens situation shapes up in the future, and as they get more and more into that, then I may be interested.
Oh, one of the nice things is the ZTF adapter, so you can use your old Nikon lenses. I don't know about Tamron.
Yeah, I think the adapter would still work, because it would just be for the to the Nikon mount. But I don't see any advantage of it if I'm using those big bulky lenses and my body's a little bit smaller. It's like I don't think I'll really notice the difference on the once you're carrying all that other weight.
Yeah, true enough. The nice thing about the mirrorless, I think anyway, is having your live histogram in the viewfinder. So, and it's pretty much what you see is what you get, as far as I can tell. So far, I haven't used it a lot, but so far I've been pretty happy with it.
Yeah, and I use the 850, when on the landscape, model. I like one I call my landscape camera and one's my wildlife, and hopefully I don't change the lenses on those two very often. So I use it, in live view mode a whole lot, and I like it kind of as a live view camera. There's a couple things I think Nikon's implementation of the touch screen is nowhere near as elegant as Canon's is, but it does work really well as a live view camera, which makes it operate more like a mirrorless. And I do find that I use it that way much more when I'm doing landscape. I hardly ever look through the viewfinder doing landscape. It's usually all on the back on the LCD.
Yeah, same here. That's wonderful innovation for landscape photography.
Yeah, I did find though with yesterday, I just got a variable neutral density filter that fits that 24 to 85, and when I have the filter on, even though it looks bright and I'm focusing on the touch screen and I touch the screen and it shows green and that it's in focus. A lot of them with the neutral density filter weren't in focus. So I have to figure out how to deal with that situation and do a few more tests. That was a little disappointing because it was telling me it was in focus, and when I got the pictures back, they weren't.
Yeah, I would think that would be kind of tough for the focusing system with a 15 stop
No,
neutral density filter.
this was just like a 5-stop,
Oh, okay.
using the variable. Yeah, with the 15, I don't expect it to focus very well, but with this one is just a 1 to 5 stop variable, and it was having issues that I didn't think it would have.
Hmm.
So I have to figure out what that is and test it a little bit more.
Sure. Before we go, why don't you talk about your workshops and your videos and your books and where people can find them?
Okay. Well, the easiest place to find me is my website, which is just www.lewiskemper.com, LEWISKEMPER.com. And on there, I list all my workshops and my training videos and all those types of things. I have a couple thousand images you can look at and see. But the upcoming trips that I have, that I still have spaces on, I actually still have space on my Alaska bear trip next summer, which is kind of unusual to have spaces left at this time of year. Usually it fills up by now. I have a trip to Namibia, Africa next year that should be really cool. There's still spaces for the trip to India to photograph tigers in the spring. And I think I have one space left on my wildlife model workshop in June up to Triple D Game Farm to photograph animals in a captive situation. I haven't posted yet, but I'll be doing my Expand Your Creativity workshops in the Monterey area in the springtime and back in Mono Lake in October. And I'll be posting those workshops in the next week or so. Right now I'm busy. I'm starting something new. I'm doing a 5-month-long online masterclass, which is basically eight lessons that you get, and you have 2 weeks to work on each lesson. And we'll be doing live critiques with it, one-on-one screen sharing critiques with my students, and we'll have group hangouts where the whole class gets together, hopefully with people from all over the country, and covering subjects on light and color and composition, depth of field, image stacking, reducing depth of field, Lightroom and ACR processing techniques, excuse me, long exposure creativity techniques, and HDR. So I've been busy putting that together, and the first session is starting in January, and I have a full class right now, and hopefully it'll all work out great, and it'll be something I'll be offering more of in the future.
Yeah, that sounds like a great series. Who is the master class aimed at, would you say?
I'd say it's aimed at, serious hobbyists and people who want to just advance what they've been doing with their photography for a while, people who kind of feel stuck and want to move on and take their pictures, as I call it, take your pictures to the max, take your photography to the max, and just kind of kickstart and boost your photographic experience and try some new things and learn some new techniques.
Yeah, you have plenty of those. Looking at your website, you're doing lots of interesting things that I never would have even thought of. So good to check all that out.
Well, thank you.
So thanks again for coming back on the show, Lewis. It's been great fun as usual. A lot of interesting stuff for people to check out on the two systems if they're trying to make that choice.
You can't go wrong with either one. And if I wasn't doing something that was so totally kind of unique, specific, or whatever, I was perfectly happy with the Canon cameras and loved them for years and years. And but it came down to that one thing that was sort of driving me crazy and wanting to get better results. And I'm definitely getting better results doing those long exposures than I was getting before. I just have to get over all the other things and hope someday they design a good camera.
Okay. Well, hopefully Nikon's listening. I
Yeah.
have, I have to say, as a
Yeah.
long
If they want some pointers and some tips, I have some suggestions. Yeah.
I have
Um,
to say, as a longtime Nikon user, that things have been getting better, and there's always some frustrations, but overall, the cameras have gotten better with each generation. So
oh
I
yeah.
suppose,
And everybody, I mean, there's so many good cameras out there, and it really just depends on what you're doing and what type of photography you want to take advantage of, sort of.
right? Yeah, very true.
Yeah, I don't think you can go wrong with any of them these days.
Yeah, a nice problem to have
Yeah,
in some
right,
respects.
exactly.
Well,
Yeah,
I appreciate your willingness to share your experiences and switching from one system to another, and I hope everybody found it interesting and helpful. So this podcast is published on the 15th and 30th of each month and is available at www.photographingthewest.net, on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Stitcher, as well as most other RSS feeds. Please leave us a review on iTunes. The link to the review site is in the show notes. Talk to you in a couple of weeks, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.